I'll try to make certain statements which might impress you as if I'm sending a telegram to some place, because the original text was very long, and I've tried to condense it as much as I can. Northern assault has enriched the tradition of using words in opposition to their real meanings. Do interventions bring freedom and democracy for the targeted people? President Obama reacted to the bloody advance of some armed Sunni fundamentalists in Iraq and Syria only when they seemed to come closer and closer to the oil areas, but not before, when they were butchering some Arabs, Turkomans, and the Yazidis. And Obama's reaction, if it can be defended at all, only against that particular group of terrorists is not convincing either. Frank response, perhaps, should have enveloped all terrorist groups. Some armed fundamentalists, in absolute contradiction to the very origins of Islam, are carrying out brutal activism. In fairness, however, one must remember that the crimes of the al-Baghdadi are not yet a fraction of the bloodshed caused by the United States in Iraq. The American History Channel, praising the efficiency of an improved sniper's rifle, stated that a soldier had managed to kill 146 civilians in one day only in Iraq. And I suffered the agony of watching the recorded film of these very murders. One may have a closer look at the main actor. In the United States, is the United States a democracy itself or just a Republican form of government? One cannot call a society democratic if ruled by inequality and vast profits for the few, with most essential areas of life designed outside public control. The average Americans have regrettably moved from stamp riots to shopping sprees and lost in the meantime the spirit of social protest. Both political parties, each seemingly obsessed with power, monopolized and lowered politics with fiscal waste, brushed their constitution aside, pursued a buccaneering foreign policy, and paid very little respect for moral principles. Their experience attests that money buys influence, the wealthy get served, and the pauperized are left to bleed. The American people should blame themselves for permitting their democracy to be hijacked. Even men and women in the street seemed enjoying heavy bombardment of Iraq, often with jubilant hurrahs. The Abu Ghraib wreck once more proved, on the other hand, that foreign soldiers may be vicious tormentors. Even the Baghdad Museum, which housed exquisite masterpieces from early Stone Age down to the late Islamic eras, was looted. The US Embassy in Baghdad now consists of 21 buildings on 104-acre land, but Mesopotamia is presently more divided than ever and living and dying in virtual hell. The peoples of the global South should also hold themselves responsible if the CIA or think tanks are allowed to manipulate elections in many corners of the world. American political leaders tap the nation's try to reshape the world according to their own interests, which they advocate as necessary for the preservation of the American way of life, which actually means that the top 1% controls 1/4 of the nation's income. Small partners in foreign lands largely concur that the US brand of dollar-based free market, which works best with a hidden fist, means controlled society by the authority of international capital. The assumption is that free markets and US-tailored democracy would alter the global South, but the consequences should burst this propaganda balloon. The Pentagon's war on terrorism seemingly requires invasions of imperial dimensions followed by years of occupation. There may only be a facade of restricted local rule. It is supposed to be a different kind of empire, devoted to freedom and human rights and without colonies. Although the imperial overstretch argument of the assassinated President Kennedy is largely forgotten now, there are lessons in the rise and fall of the past great powers. There are limits to that power, and our age may be also one of revolt. The United States does not possess the prerequisites to decide which country have what kind of a regime. The appalling scenario has often been to overthrow a regime, not for the benefit of the targeted people, but for the ideology of the occupying power. Now, as far as the Middle East or the global South in general is concerned, where Islam predominates, Islam has never been, neither in history or now, monolithic. There are tensions not only between the United States and Russia, and China and Iran on the other hand. There are competition and conflict among Islamist politics, mainly between, for instance, Wahhabiyya of Saudi Arabia on the one side, Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt and Al-Qaeda and some of its affiliates. There are regional Islamist confrontations between Saudis and Iran, between Saudis and even the United Arab Republic, between Egypt and Iran, and so on. There are new dissidents and new alignments, but these may be tactical and temporary. So what about the future? Just a few words. The Islamist parties were the first winners of the Arab Spring. They have considerable grassroots supports, organizational skill, discipline in the rank and file, and promises, not necessarily kept and not necessarily accomplishments, that gave them power in several Middle Eastern and North African countries. Some of their leaders cannot fulfill their roles. Some are brutal, and therefore Islam, in my personal opinion, is not ready for participatory politics, perhaps except in Turkey. Islam will compete with radical cousins on the right and with liberals on the left. It seems, however, that democracy and Islam will not survive without the other in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, I wish to say a few words about the Ukrainian crisis. US policies for the Ukraine during the last 2 decades may have tragic consequences in the near future for international security because of America's ongoing encirclement of Russia and its attempts to include the Ukraine into its NATO designs. There's the danger now of a new Cold War and a new US-Russian confrontation since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Secretary of State John Kerry talks publicly like a Secretary of War. The new Cold War will be worse than former US-Soviet confrontation. The confrontation now is very near to Russia's border. It's no longer in Berlin or in the forests of Cuba. Presently, moreover, there are no restraining rules of the previous Cold War. There is no effective opposition, even in the United States, in connection with the emerging new Cold War. There is no such public pressure coming from the Americans themselves on the White House or on the Congress or on the media. Russia's views on the Ukraine is totally missing in the public eye and in mainstream coverage in the world, especially in the United States. US policies are once more entirely one-sided, nationally bipartisan, and conformistic. Moreover, they are full of misinformation and misconceptions. Since 1991, the US government treated post-Soviet Russia as if it was a defeated country and took the opportunity to expand NATO in the former Soviet republics. Ukraine was now a sovereign independent state, but made up of two peoples. The European Union expected Russia to adhere to Europe's military and security policies. It was not Russia's Putin who initiated a crisis, but the velvet aggression of both Washington and Brussels to pull the whole of Ukraine into the West and, if possible, into NATO. Moreover, the European Union program offered little financial assistance to the Ukraine, but asked its government to apply harsh austerity measures and curb its long-standing relations with neighboring Russia. The US and EU endorsed the coup in Ukraine after radically nationalist and violent demonstrations of semi-fascist groups. Russia's actions were on the whole reactive. The underlying causes were Ukraine's own internal divisions, not Putin's reactions. Putin can ask the rebels to negotiate if Washington asks Kiev to stop assaults, but it has not done it so far. In short, US policy for the last 2 decades led to today's American-Russian confrontation. The solution rests on the following 2 pillars. Ukraine should not be forced to align itself with a military coalition, foremost with NATO. Secondly, Ukraine should be allowed to maintain and develop economic relations with both Russia and the West. We may raise our voice here to support some yet feeble initiatives in the United States. For instance, that of Gilbert Doktorov to create a US-European version of the Committee of East-West Accord, and John Marsheimer's article in the September-October 2014 of New York Foreign Affairs magazine. That was an exception that gave some space to Moscow's views as well. But the real choice of the dichotomy that we have between the global North and the global South is between change in compliance with the headquarters of developed capitalism or a breakaway from it. With few exceptions, the nations of the South harmonize with the imperatives of the northern market economy. International capital transformed most of the bourgeoisies of the global south into compradors incapable of utilizing the opportunities to the advantage of their own countries. So it is some sort of abnormal unification. How do we build a movement to shatter the myths of the authoritarian oligarchic systems? Of course, one should start with a vision. The majority of the peoples feel that politicians and major institutions are not providing for them. Since misinformation is manufactured by the leading rogue state, there is still a stupefying black hole in public knowledge about the real events almost everywhere. The gap between facts and lies is too wide to ignore. To be aware of the facts is the first premise, but not enough. To fight distortion depends on the ability to forward facts together with political action. The media is under the command of the 1% almost everywhere. Conferences with global attributes are appropriate, but rhetoric is inadequate. People should stand up and change their lives. Of course, I'm not suggesting an armed rebellion, but the process begins when people look to the community rather than the politicians, who cannot function without the cooperation of the former. The first step is to win large public opinion. Our meeting here is just one, although an exceptional one and a very important one, of the stations on a continuing journey during which everybody has to carry on from where we have left. The question is how to activate the average people, the main force that can bring change. In order to claim democracy, men and women have to be empowered with new organizing models so they can collectively demand different public policies. Collective self-confidence is a must for powerful democratic movements. An astonishing concentration of power is presently in the hands of corporations and the wealthy. The workers, on the other hand, lack a voice. But the Occupy movement, also termed as "We Are the 99%, had transformed the national discourse, even in the United States, concerning inequality. Millions demonstrated in North Africa. So the other superpower may well be world public opinion. The contemporary world system is not only a constraint, but also a generator on more democratic movements. Contradictions in the system are so obvious and so towering that change is inevitable. The core ideology of ending the exploitation of men by men still exists as long as capitalism lives in one form or another. As Eduardo Galeano once remarked, let us not try to bury the wrong corpse. Many nations, including the Americans, suffer the absence of convincing alternatives which may necessitate new progressive parties. The agenda of the latter needs to be the defeat of the neoliberals, the fascists, oligarchic political systems, corrupt economies, and the sanguinary fundamentalists, and moreover, for the right reasons. Success depends on the level of commitment and clarity of strategy. So there is still room for effective politics by progressive movements within some states. Certain rules have to be changed. Successful results have been either reforms or total transformations. If the possibility allows reform only, the byproduct will be increased corporate responsibility and accountability. Transformations, however, call for comprehensive rethinking. In any case, the natural heritage of land, air, water, forests, and fisheries have to be protected. The heritage of culture as well. Many nations cannot provide their own food, and what their people have may not be enough or safe. NAFTA is trying to break up in Mexico the traditional communal land ownership by the Mayas that had been successfully reinforced by the Zapatista revolution. Privatized industrial agriculture breeds ecological and health risks and insists on monocultures that produce largely luxury items for export. Brazil's soybean exports may feed the pet animals of the European folks, but hunger in that largest South American country increases steadily. Healthy food, on the other hand, is a basic human right. When market fundamentalism assured that national boundaries had come crashing down, the Bolivian workers nevertheless kept their water system out of the hands of Bechtel, and the Indian peasants asserted their property rights against Cargill and Monsanto. An unwanted corporation may be prevented from entering a certain community. The farmers in Goa did not accept DuPont to transfer its unsafe nylon manufacturing plant from the United States to India. Corporations with special rights and exemptions may cause deaths on account of plant explosions or destroy a coastline when oil leaks from a tanker. Rules need to be changed because both Union Carbide in Bhopal and Exxon escape liability in blasts and oil leaks. The old and new globalization regimes such as the World Bank, IMF, World Trade Organization, NAFTA, or the Free Trade Area of the Americas are blueprinted to serve the interests of these big corporations. They should either be terminated or renegotiated. Transition to more democratic forms is possible. Large corporations may be broken up and part of the business may be sold to workers, suppliers, and other community members. Small farms and factories, local independent businesses, cooperatives of various types, and worker-oriented enterprises can better provide the primary sources of livelihood for the majority of the world's peoples. There is no need for big corporations to distribute food and print books, dictate terms and prices, and take away all profits. If corporations are to exist, even within a reform system, they would be forced to act in a socially responsible manner. The mere reformist model addresses some aspects of the socioeconomic problems and thereby reduces the most deplorable consequences of core periphery contradictions, but does not break away from big capital. Protest movements, or, as our first speaker this afternoon said, globalization from below, is needed to check globalization from above. The effective reaction to multinational domination can be citizen initiatives for a just world economy. Those who favor transformations rather than simple reforms underline that corporations, not being people, lack conscience and will not act humanly. A progressive agenda should include a social control of production or comparatively reduced private control, countering imperial or neo-colonial hegemony, and opposing wars, and also defending democracy, individual and minority rights, gender equality, and the natural environment. Poverty or underdeveloped in the global south cannot be erased by imitating the northern model. Venezuela's Chavez had chosen to present to Obama a copy of The Open Veins of Latin America, the much acclaimed book that accounts how the big northern neighbor drained the lower half of the whole continent. Either fundamental reforms or complete transformation will be better for the South and for the North. Thank you very much.